Okay, so now we have heard the call, and it's been ferocious because it deals with a part of life of ourselves. If you're dealing specifically with sexual abuse, you can use this framework for any sort of trauma, or even just writing about trauma, and I will be doing a lot of that with you later. And the next part is, to me, one of the most difficult but interesting parts of the whole thing. And for me, this spanned 30 years. I'm hoping that if I kind of lay out what I did to get through a lot of this, it'll make your journey a lot quicker. Not to say that it won't require a lot of work to understand deep subconscious shadow material, like some people would call this shadow work. But I felt like I was laying new groundwork because I couldn't find a way through with the tools that were available to me in the 80s. So I started finding my own. It was just out of desperation. I was, as I told you, feeling like I wanted to die. It got pretty bad, and it was happening several times a week. So I began to understand that there were incidents, the episodic amnesia incidents, but there was also this overlying threat. And it is a threat that has been in culture at large for a really, really long time when we are talking about sexual healing. The problem is we don't want to talk about it, and it's taboo to talk about it. And there's a lot of sexual taboo that goes on before a child is old enough to verbalize that sort of environment and that sort of behavior. And that was in my case. My brain, my words couldn't tell me anything because it was so deep and so early, and over a period of many years. For me to put language on it that occurred 30 years later. I mean, that's why I went back and got my master's and started working on a PhD, because I did want to put language to it, because I did want to communicate the transformation aspects of it in culture. So I needed to be able to use words. I learned how to use art in art school. I went to film school for 2.5 years. I directed films and learned how to tell stories through film. And I had a creative writing background in undergrad. So I had all of these tools, and I had the sense that those tools were there to help me deal with this monster, this big monster, which is, in my case, was incest and sexual abuse. And I went through molestation with a family member, and then later in my first year of college, date rape. So a lot of trauma around sexuality. And so many people go through this. We're just hearing about some of it now, thank goodness, with the internet, and so many people can talk about what happened and do things like, #MeToo and all that. But when I was starting out with all this, there were no hashtags, there was no internet, there was just silence, and there was a lot of anger when people did talk, or there were threats of legal ramifications, people being put in jail, just if you just wanted to explore whether something happened to you or not. The field of psychology had to immediately report it. And there's a good aspect of that, of course, but there's also a bad aspect, because somebody like me, I wasn't sure. I wanted to be sure about what happened to me before I said anything. Gosh, how horrible. Involved my family, which I loved. I still love dearly. But what had feasted on my family and ancestors was this thing called incest and child sexual abuse. So your monster may be something else. It may be different. It may have a different word. It may have different context culturally. But if you identify the monster, and we're just calling it a monster, it's not a judgment, because truthfully, well, it took 30 years, but I started understanding what the other people involved had going on with them that made them the quote monsters that they seemed to be. They dealt with monsters when they were little. So I don't think any of us are monsters. I really feel like it's this cultural entity that is laid down over the way we interact with each other socially and familially, and there's nothing we can do about that except be transparent about it. And once we're transparent, whether it's through story or film or art or just talking to friends or in a group or whatever we do to make it transparent, we take the monster's power away. And that's the point. I edit a journal, and a lot of people who've been through some serious stuff talk about that. But I started the journal because I wanted a place to exist for people who'd been through stuff to be published. And I do publish them, and it has a good effect on not only them, but people who get to read the work. And maybe you've had this happen. When you hear somebody else went through something you did, and you see that they got through it, and they're willing to tell you how, gosh, the light that brings to the situation. So dealing with the monster is what we're doing now with whatever practice you decide to use. I'm going to primarily be dealing with writing because it's simple. We can do it, over the internet. And I do encourage people to work visually and to use, video also, because any format that feels good to your heart is that part of you that needs to talk to you. It's a way for that part of you to talk that it feels comfortable with. So I started out, I was on stage by the time I was 2.5, something like that. So I'm very comfortable presenting stuff to people or performing stuff. But I also made a lot of art, so whatever it is. And if you can't identify any of that for yourself, start exploring. That is so much fun. Just go to an art store and just walk around and see what appeals to you. Maybe it's a pencil, maybe it's a whole paint set. Maybe you want to pick up your phone and you want to start making videos. Whatever it is, just start expressing yourself. You don't have to show anybody, but you might want to watch what you did. It's really hard for me to watch something I do, but once I do, I'm like, whoa, I can really see that part of me speaking to me, and there's a connection, and it helps vanquish the monster and my fear of it. For 30 years, I woke up every morning afraid that what I thought happened really didn't, and I was insane, or I was a liar, or just a bad person, because I was told by people that I told what happened to me that I was bad. And so it took me a long time, but I kind of like the way it happened. I had to figure out for myself the truth. And basically, we all do. All right, we have one more aspect of the storytelling process we're going to go through, and then we'll start getting in there and really working with it.